Welcome to the ITIL Framework updated course from Cybrary IT. My name is Daniel Reilly. I'm your subject matter expert on the ITIL Framework. In this video, I'd like to talk to you about the service strategy section of the framework, and specifically the goals and processes that form up the service strategy. When we're talking about goals, it's good to keep in mind what a goal should be, and I like this acronym here. A goal should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. That means it should be SMART. So what we're going to do is we're going to decide on a strategy to serve our customers, and to form that strategy, we're going to use a market needs assessment and use case research. These are a mix of qualitative and quantitative values that assess where our market is and where we can fit in and serve the needs of clients. So part of our goals is to define what services and products will be offered to which markets, and also to define any capabilities that are missing from the organization that we need to fulfill these obligations, such as HR, technical, or material. So these are the list of the main processes that form the service strategy. That's strategy management, service portfolio management, financial management for IT services, demand management, and business relationship management. And we'll talk about all these in more detail in a moment. Starting with the plan for the overall process here. Each of our processes is going to follow this sort of pattern, starting with planning and decision making, which is where we're going to determine the course of actions for the process. Then we're going to organize who the process owners are and coordinate the activities that they'll oversee. One of those people will, of course, be in charge of leading and managing the process. And finally, that will be involved with controlling, which is monitoring and reporting on the process to make sure that it's still efficient and meets needs. So talking about service strategy management, we're going to go through a process that's very much iterative, but we like to lay it out on a line since there's a lot of information to take in here. We're going to start with gathering facts, and this is internal and external information about our company, how we're structured, as well as our competition and the market. We're going to use that to inform the next step, which is called a SWOT analysis. This stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Strengths and weaknesses form the internal part of the analysis, while opportunities and threats form the outside, the external. We're going to review our inputs, which are the facts and the analysis that we've performed. And we're going to send this out to all the stakeholders, and we're going to find through 3 or 4 key ideas that summarize our overall strategic plan for this market. We're going to use that to create the next phase, which is a strategic matrix. Using the information we formed in the SWOT, the strengths and weaknesses will get paired up, strengths with opportunities and weaknesses with opportunities, and then strengths and threats and weaknesses and threats. And this just gives you an overall idea of where you need to work most effectively. You'll take that and you'll define the strategies to fill these most important areas. You'll create a list of objectives, and then long and short-term strategies with mile markers to know how you're achieving them. And then finally, once you come up with these plans, you'll send all of this out for review to all of the stakeholders, who might come back with adjustments as necessary. So to kind of just summarize this at a high level, what we're going to do is assess the service provider's offerings currently, as well as our competitors and market needs. We're going to take a look at the current and potential market spaces that the companies are operating in and identify possibly new verticals that the company can move to. We're going to develop a strategy to serve our customers. And I think a key thing that hasn't been mentioned previously, but is crucial to understand, is that the strategy to serve customers must focus on securely delivering services to them by design. More and more regulations are requiring secure delivery by design, and it's part of ITIL should be focusing on the security up front by design. The service strategy management is not something that you do once at the beginning and then just leave in place. It's responsible for maintaining the strategy throughout this implementation or this iteration and all future iterations as well. So you should always start off a cycle of your service management by reviewing your current strategy and assessing if it's still applicable. Now, this is a graphic that I took off of the Axilos website, which describes the service portfolio, and I think it's really good to use theirs as a reference. So in the top portion, we have what is defined as the actual service portfolio, and it's broken into 3 trunks. In the beginning, you have an idea, which gets fed into the service pipeline, the uppermost left portion. As that goes through your service pipeline, it gets from an idea to an operational service. That operational service gets added into the service catalog. Finally, as a service becomes outdated or superseded by other services, we may find the need to retire a service, and so that goes into the third rightmost section. Now, all of these are tied together by a system called the configuration management system. The configuration management system is important for different reasons at different stages of the service portfolio. During the service pipeline, you need to be especially aware as you add services or modify services, how that has an effect on the overall configuration. You may need to plan to add new configuration fields or new entities altogether. For instance, if a service lives on its own server, that server needs to be updated as part of the configuration management, and therefore new entries have to be added. During the service catalog, you're going to rely on the configuration management system to handle things like updating and sensible settings. And finally, the retired services section is sort of the inverse of the service pipeline section. As you retire a service, you need to be aware of what configurations may no longer be necessary or outdated, and make sure that you remove those according to the change management process. Finally, the lower section here, we won't dive into too much detail. It simply shows what sections make up the portfolio, and that is the customer portfolio, the list of people who are using particular services, an application portfolio, which is services or applications that are in use to serve client needs. Supplier and contract management information system is oftentimes used by resource planning teams. These are more common at higher levels. In small businesses, this is more often than not an ad hoc process. A customer agreement portfolio is a list of service level agreements and contracts with clients. The project portfolio is upcoming work that's going to come into or out of the service pipeline. These are oftentimes shared over long planned roadmaps. And finally, the customer management databases, which hold all of the information for your relationship management, which we'll talk about more. So we're going to create and manage this service portfolio, and I'll talk more about how we'll do that in a moment. But one, we're going to need to document however we decide to create this portfolio. We're going to need to document the service name, the life cycle state, and don't get too caught up on the example states that are here. Life cycle states are oftentimes renamed to fit the organization that is using them. We're going to list the service type, which is more generally applicable. The three types that you can generally rely on seeing are either client facing, which are what you are actually retailing as services or products, and then internal, which are services that are set up specifically to meet other internal business units' needs. And finally, external, which may be used to fulfill other business obligations, such as an information sharing service for a third-party platform. Finally, we're going to list customers using the service and service sign-up contacts. So these are the procedures and information that a client will need when they want to become a new user on the service or gain more information. It's important to keep that documented somewhere. All right. On the next section, we're going to document descriptions of the justification. This will most likely come in the form of the business analysis that we talked about in the strategy section previously. With the market analysis, we will find a justification for the services or the service modifications. We're going to list our desired outcomes. Here are just a couple of examples. But the idea of listing the desired outcomes is so that you have a record of intended consequences so that you can later analyze intended and unintended consequences. And in the next section, I will talk to you about a principle called the Goodhart Law, which applies here. But we list our desired outcomes so that we can monitor for this later. We're also going to want to keep track of package variations. This is different ways that we may sell the service for different client needs. A good example here might be the way insurance is sold and bundled differently based off of different levels of coverage. And we're going to want to record our cost to serve and pricing, which will actually cover under the financial management for IT section. But we're going to want to record it into our service portfolio so that as we're analyzing our services, we can have a cost to serve and trending, which will inform our pricing structure. And then, of course, we're going to want to have any specific rules for the service and define any penalties or chargebacks for misuse. We're going to want to have dependencies listed, and these are service dependencies which the current service must have to rely on. In the example here, you might have an external dependency such as plastic molds from supplier X. If the service being documented cannot run without molds from supplier X, it needs to be documented here, and it should be performed as a risk analysis. And the same thing with site hosting from a vendor. There are lots of options for hosting, so perhaps you should also list backups. Supported services are kind of the inverse of dependencies, services which are dependent upon this one. So when you write your service portfolio, if you're on a service and you've just written that it has a dependency on some other service internally, you should also go to that service and update its supported services as well. You're going to want to include a link or an actual change roadmap in future iterations. This simply is a list of decided changes that have been planned for some future release or update to the service. And finally, on this, you're going to want a glossary of the nomenclature. Generally, when you create a service, you may have to invent or overload some words, which is the terminology that you use to describe the service. And it's important to record these meanings and the overloaded uses of words, so that way when we have discussions relating to this service, we can make sure that everybody has the same understanding as to what we're talking about. Now, with software options for managing this, uh, service catalog management software is going to help you improve the maintainability of your service catalog, and it's going to do that by using the software to enforce things like the dependencies. Um, if you go to retire a service that is dependent or supports another service, then you don't want to do that without having an adequate plan to replace the service that you're retiring. It's going to make your catalog more portable, because the software is oftentimes web hosted these days, and therefore you can work on it across systems. And finally, you have error protection. Now, there are open source and paid options that already exist. I am a proponent of open source, and if it's an option in your organization, I highly suggest checking into the open source options. If not, there are, of course, services that will help you manage your catalog. And also, from personal experience, it's not difficult to implement your own. I was asked to build a small application to manage the service catalog, um, and I did so in Python in a matter of probably 3 months or less. Now, this is actually one of the models that I use from that, to demonstrate the linking between two services. Um, you can see here that this is the information we've covered that you would want to uh, have documented, and in each side of the angle brackets would be a link to another section of the program which details the information. And the central arrows were what was maintained by the software. These are the software dependencies. Um, so now for the financial management for IT services, um, our main goals and process are going to define and manage the service budget, um, and charging structure. Like we talked about, they're going to form a cost to serve for each service and then for overall packaging. They're going to do this through a financial planning review, and then they're going to do an analysis and reporting on that review. Um, these are generally going to inform the service guidelines and the invoicing structure for clients. This is the point at which we determine what model of revenue we're going to use per service, if it's going to differ for each service. So with the budget request allocation process, um, each service department will have its own budget that it can spend either annually or every 2 years, depending on your organization. But the financial management processes will define uh, a, a specific way in which departments can request for new budgets, and they'll define the guidelines for ways that the budget will be allocated fairly. Now, this is all part of the cost to serve analysis, and the budget and request allocation process is informed by that, in such a way that previously IT had one budget, and let's say the human resources department had their budget. Some of the IT budget was spent on providing IT services for the human resources department. So we use business chargebacks as part of our cost to serve for internal services. And for external services, we use the same idea to inform the overall pricing structure for our clients. And one thing that's worth mentioning is that direct costs to serve, such as money for packaging and materials, are different than indirect costs to serve. For instance, if you have a lot of shipping, Um, Driving to deliver packages to a shipping warehouse might be an indirect cost that you would want to work into your overall cost to serve if it makes sense for your application. So this is kind of just a model of what we're talking about. You start with your planning, you go through your accounting processes, which is to record and analyze, and then you go into your reporting, and then you cycle back through your analysis of your changes. So moving on into demand management, this one is best viewed as a two-way conveyor belt. If you start with the patterns of your business activity, this is your client behavior. What of your services are most used versus which are not. Um, this business process is a constant spinning wheel that feeds back to itself in the short run. However, it also creates a demand pattern, which can be seen as the belt feeding towards the right on the top. This goes back to your service process. This is generally the back end processes which handle things like capacity planning. Now, these days, a lot of capacity planning has to do with horizontal and vertical scalability. So, horizontal scalability is the ability to bring up multiple instances of your service next to each other. That way, no one particular part of the service uh, can become bogged down. Vertical scaling is using one service but throwing more resources at that one service. And this is not so popular anymore with the major use of cloud and virtual machines and Docker containers. It's become far less chic to use vertical scaling and far more predominant to use horizontal scaling. So the overall process is to estimate the service demand and plan for how the future will scale. Now, with horizontal scaling, a lot of times this involves putting an elastic load balancer in front of your service to help distribute the traffic. But there are other types of demand that are not for IT, and you're going to want to cover all of the demand on your customer service team, your sales team. Um, Demand levels change over time, so you're going to want to have a plan for measuring uh, and adjusting that as well. Uh, as we talked about, cloud services often use auto scaling features, which are horizontally scaling virtual machines, which can be programmatically created and destroyed. And the reason that we do this is to balance between not enough service and having idle resources. We don't ever want to have a client try to reach our service and have to turn them away because we are overloaded. At the same time, we don't want to pay for computational resources we're not going to be using. So we are trying to optimize our cost efficiency there. Now, the last section here is business relationship management. And this is a key one because ITIL is driven by market needs. And business relationship management is all about building the positive relationships with your clients. You're going to use those positive relationships with them to gain insight from their use of your system, as well as their views on their business. And that's going to inform you as to what their upcoming needs might be. And you can create services that seem to appear just in time to meet new needs as they arise. This also reduces risk of client turnover because when you form a good relationship with your client, they're more likely to come to you with any concerns or problems. They're also more likely to give you information about upcoming needs they might see. And this is all in support of the sustainability of the company. So when we were talking about business modeling, we were mostly focused on the financial revenue aspect. But as we spread out, we also have to consider the other portions. And in this case, we're supporting the sustainability, like I mentioned. Here's kind of a model that I came up with of the business relationship flow. It starts with engaging your clients. That's the green circle on the left, and that goes into forming the relationship. And then once you form a relationship, it's very important to understand the rules in that relationship, and it's key to building trust with a client, that they know and that you understand what is okay in terms of their data or their information to be asking about, what's appropriate and what is inappropriate. Um, you're going to want to bring value to this relationship. It is not one-sided. You're not only trying to get at their data or their use of your service to better your business, but you do want to bring a value to them. You want the service to truly meet a need for them. And finally, you're going to want to demonstrate that value to them so that you have that positive feedback. You can show them how you brought value to their relationship with you, and they will become more engaged, and the relationship will become stronger, and the whole cycle continues. With that, we've come to the end of this video. I'd like to thank you for watching, and as always, if you have any questions, you can contact me on cybrary.it. My username is Twarter, Twarter.